My sister Bianca called me at exactly 2:14 in the morning. Her voice was trembling, cracking at all the right moments, a performance worthy of an Academy Award. Olivia, she sobbed into the phone. Mom is gone. She passed away in her sleep at the nursing home an hour ago. I am so sorry, but it is over. I held the phone away from my ear, swirling the dark red Pinot Noir in my glass, watching the city lights of Chicago flicker through my penthouse window. Across the living room, the woman my sister had just pronounced dead was sitting in her favorite velvet armchair, sipping a cup of hot Earl Grey tea and shaking her head in disbelief. My mother was not dead. She was simply tired of their lies. But I did not tell Bianca that. Instead, I put on my best terrified voice and whispered, "Oh my God, are you sure?" I let her believe she had won. I let her believe the estate was finally hers. Because the only thing sweeter than saving your mother from a nursing home is watching your greedy sister dig her own grave. Before I tell you how I orchestrated the most satisfying funeral in family history, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever been the underestimated underdog in your own family. My name is Olivia, and at 32 years old, I am what my family calls the disappointment. To them, I am just the boring single workaholic who refuses to enjoy life. My sister Bianca and her husband Brad think power comes from brand names, leased luxury SUVs, and social status. They look down on me because I do not carry a Hermes Birkin bag or vacation in the Hamptons. They call me the black sheep because I drive a sensible sedan and refused to fund their lavish lifestyle years ago. What they fail to understand is that silence is not weakness. They see a quiet girl in a cheap suit, but they do not realize what I actually do for a living. I am not just an accountant. I am a forensic accountant. I do not just look at numbers. I hunt for the truth hidden inside them. I find the money people try to hide and the debts they try to bury. Fortune 500 companies hire me to find the bodies in their financial statements. So when Bianca and Brad decided to fake our mother's death to claim a $2 million life insurance policy, they made a fatal miscalculation. They judged me by my lack of designer labels. But while my sister holds a purse worth $10,000 that she bought on credit, I hold the passwords to every single bank account in this family. They thought they were the predators, but they just walked blindly into a cage I built for them 10 years ago. The vibration of my cell phone against the glass coffee table sounded like a drill in the dead of night. 2:14 in the morning, a time reserved for emergencies or bad news. But as I looked at the caller ID flashing the name Bianca, I knew it was neither. It was a performance. I let it ring 3 times before sliding my finger across the screen. I did not say hello. I simply listened to the sound of heavy, ragged breathing on the other end. It was theatrical, the kind of hyperventilating someone does when they want to ensure you know they are devastated. Then came the voice. Olivia. Oh God, Olivia. Bianca choked out my name as if it physically pained her to speak. She is gone. Mom is gone. Her voice cracked perfectly on the last word. I took a slow sip of my wine, feeling the cool liquid coat my throat, while my sister continued her monologue. She went peacefully in her sleep. The nurses said she did not feel a thing. It was her heart, Olivia. Her big, tired heart just stopped. It was a compelling story. Almost believable if I did not know that our mother had the heart of an ox and the blood pressure of a fighter pilot. But the real crack in her performance came not from her, but from the background. Through the receiver, I heard a rustling sound followed by a harsh, impatient whisper that was definitely not a nurse. Ask her about the safety deposit box key. Ask her now before she hangs up. It was Brad. My brother-in-law could not even wait for my mother's body to get cold in his imagination before looking for the loot. A normal sister would have collapsed. A normal daughter would have been screaming. But I am a forensic accountant. I do not react to emotion. I react to inconsistency. I kept my voice flat, stripping away any hint of the shock they expected. Which physician pronounced her dead, Bianca? The line went silent. The sobbing stopped abruptly. "Excuse me," she stammered, dropping the grieving act for a split second. I repeated the question, enunciating every syllable. To issue a death certificate at this hour, a physician must be present. Who signed the time of death? Was it Dr. Reynolds or the on-call staff? I could practically hear the gears grinding in her head as she looked at Brad for help. It was Dr. Phillips, she lied. A generic name for a generic lie. We are handling everything, Olivia. You just focus on getting here. Do not worry about the arrangements. Brad and I have taken control. I almost laughed. Control was the one thing they never had. I will see you at the funeral, I said, and ended the call before she could ask for the key. They wanted a tragedy. I was going to give them a war. I looked down at the crumpled piece of paper resting on my mahogany coffee table. It was not a death certificate. It was a past due invoice from Shady Pines Care Center dated exactly 28 days ago. That yellowing piece of paper was more than just a bill. It was the smoking gun that was going to put my brother-in-law behind bars for elder abuse and fraud. To understand why I was sipping wine instead of crying over my mother's alleged death, you have to understand where they put her when they thought no one was watching. They called Shady Pines an assisted living facility. I called it a waiting room for the grave. A month ago, while I was in London auditing a firm, Brad convinced Bianca that Mom was becoming a burden. He spun a tale about her needing professional help, claiming she was a danger to herself. But Shady Pines was not about care. It was the kind of place you send someone when you want them to disappear. It smelled of stale urine, masked by cheap lavender air freshener and industrial bleach. The fluorescent lights buzzed with a headache-inducing hum, flickering over hallways lined with residents who looked more like statues than people. I found out the truth the moment my plane touched down. I had a bad feeling, a gut instinct honed by years of sniffing out corporate fraud. I drove straight to the facility, bypassing the sleepy receptionist. What I found in room 302 still haunts me. My mother, the woman who worked 2 jobs to send us to private school, the woman who always smelled of cocoa butter and strength, was lying in her own filth. Her sheets were gray and stained. Her lips were cracked and bleeding from dehydration. A tray of cold, unidentifiable gray mush sat on the bedside table, deliberately placed just out of her reach. She looked at me with eyes so hollow, they seemed to belong to a stranger. She was too weak to even lift her hand. When I checked the medical chart clipped to the end of her bed, I saw the signature at the bottom. Brad. He had used his power of attorney to authorize the absolute minimum care package. No physical therapy for her hips, no dietary supplements, no pain management. He had signed a do not resuscitate order without even consulting me. And where was Mom's substantial pension going? It certainly was not going to this hellhole. I pulled up the financial records right there on my tablet standing over her bed. I traced the transfers. Every single cent of her Social Security and her late husband's pension was being funneled into an offshore betting account registered under the handle Brad Crypto King. He was literally gambling away her dignity spin by spin, bet by bet. He was starving her to fund his addiction to digital currency and parlay bets on football games. Seeing her like that frail and frightened, something inside me snapped and then recalcified into something harder than diamond. I did not scream at the nurses. I did not call Bianca to beg for an explanation. I simply leaned down, kissed my mother's forehead, and whispered that I was taking her home. I walked out to the parking lot, sat in my car, and made a vow. I would not just save her, I would destroy them. I would let them think they had succeeded until the very last moment. I moved Mom out that night under the cover of darkness, paid the head nurse $3,000 cash to keep the records active but empty, and waited. I waited for them to get greedy, and tonight with that phone call they finally walked right into the trap. The extraction was surgical. I did not storm into the administrator's office screaming about lawsuits. That is what an amateur would do. Instead, I walked calmly to the nurse's station and made eye contact with Clara, the head nurse. We had history. 2 years ago, I helped her navigate a messy audit with the IRS that could have cost her license. She owed me. When I slid an envelope containing $5,000 in cash across the counter, she did not ask questions. She simply nodded and handed me the shift logs. We moved fast. Under the cover of a shift change, my private security team wheeled my mother out the service entrance. We bypassed the cameras, loaded her into the back of a black SUV with tinted windows, and vanished into the night. Clara stayed behind to doctor the logs, ensuring that on paper, Beatrice Wilson was still occupying bed 302, receiving minimal care and slowly fading away. As far as Shady Pines and my family were concerned, my mother was still a prisoner. In reality, she was resting in the guest wing of my penthouse, lying on Egyptian cotton sheets, with a view of Lake Michigan. I hired Dr. Evans, a private concierge physician, to oversee her recovery around the clock. Within 3 days of proper hydration, nutrition, and medication management, the fog in her mind cleared. The woman who Bianca claimed was senile was suddenly sharp enough to beat me at chess. As her strength returned, so did her rage. She wanted to call the police immediately when she realized Brad had drained her pension. But I stopped her. This is where people usually get confused. They ask me, "Olivia, why did you wait? Why let them think she was dead? Why let them plan a funeral?" The answer is simple and cold. If I had exposed them the moment I rescued Mom, Brad would have only been charged with elder abuse and perhaps petty theft. He would have pleaded down to probation. He would have been back on the street in 6 months, leeching off another victim. That was not acceptable to me. I needed Brad to commit a federal crime. I needed him to cross a line from which there is no return. I needed him to file that death certificate. I needed him to contact the life insurance company and formally request the payout. The moment he submits that claim for $2 million, knowing the policyholder is alive, he commits insurance fraud and wire fraud. That carries a mandatory minimum sentence in federal prison. I did not want a slap on the wrist for the man who tried to kill my mother. I wanted to bury him under the weight of the federal justice system, so we waited. We drank tea, watched movies, and waited for the phone to ring. And when it finally did at 2:14 this morning, I knew the trap had snapped shut. The morning sun was just beginning to hit the Chicago skyline when the ultimatum arrived. It appeared as a green bubble on my screen, devoid of any greeting or sibling affection. The text from Bianca was precise, cruel, and entirely transactional. "The funeral is Friday at 10 at St. Jude's Cathedral. Do not bother showing your face unless you bring the deed to the Southside property. We need to liquidate it to cover Mom's medical debts. If you come empty-handed, security will escort you out." I read the message aloud to my mother, who was sitting across from me eating avocado toast and reading the Wall Street Journal. She let out a sharp, bitter laugh. "Medical debts?" she asked, raising an eyebrow perfectly shaped by her favorite brow pencil. "The only medical debt I have is the headache they gave me." She knew as well as I did that the Southside house was free and clear. It was a historic brownstone my father had bought in the 70s, now worth over $500,000 due to rapid gentrification in the neighborhood. It was the last asset they had not managed to bleed dry solely because my father had possessed the foresight to list me as the co-trustee before he passed. Brad and Bianca were desperate. I could read the panic in the syntax of her text. They did not just want the house, they needed it immediately. The loan sharks were likely circling, and the imaginary life insurance payout from a fake death would still take weeks to process, even if it were real. They needed quick liquidity, and they thought bullying me into handing over the deed at a funeral was their winning move. They were banking on my public shame. They thought I would be too embarrassed to cause a scene in front of the pastor and the congregation that I would hand over the folder just to be allowed to sit in the front row. I picked up my phone and typed a reply, keeping it deliberately vague. "I will be there, Bianca, and I will bring exactly what you need most." I saw the typing bubble appear instantly on her end, then disappear. She took the bait. She assumed I meant the deed. She assumed I had finally broken down and accepted my role as the obedient check-writing little sister who always cleaned up their messes. I set the phone down and walked over to my home office. I opened the biometric safe hidden behind a painting on the wall. Inside there was indeed a thick legal folder waiting, but it did not contain the property deed to the brownstone. It contained 300 pages of forensic analysis bank statements linking Brad to illegal offshore gambling sites and the sworn affidavit I had secured from the nursing home staff. I slid the folder into my leather briefcase. I was going to the funeral absolutely, and I was going to bring them a gift. Not a house, but a federal indictment. The stage was set. Now I just had to pick out the perfect outfit for the performance. Friday morning arrived with a sky the color of bruised slate, matching the dark sunglasses I wore as I stepped out of my sedan. St. Jude's Cathedral loomed before me, a massive structure of glass and steel that looked less like a place of worship and more like a corporate headquarters for God. This was not the humble, historic chapel where my mother had baptized us. That church was too small, too old, and too poor for the image Bianca was trying to project. Instead, she had booked the largest megachurch in Chicago, a venue that cost more to rent for an hour than most people earned in a year. As I walked up the limestone steps, the scent hit me before I even reached the doors. It was a thick, cloying wave of sweetness that made my stomach turn. Lilies. Hundreds, perhaps thousands of white lilies were arranged in massive arches, flanking the entrance. I stopped in my tracks, staring at the white petals trembling in the wind. A stranger might have thought it was a beautiful, elegant tribute, but I knew the truth. My mother was deathly allergic to lilies. Even the pollen from a single flower would cause her throat to close up and her eyes to swell shut. For 30 years we had banned them from our house. Seeing them here massed in such grotesque abundance was the final confirmation that this event had nothing to do with mourning Beatrice Wilson. This was the Bianca show. She had chosen the flowers based on an Instagram aesthetic, likely a photo she saw on a celebrity wedding board, completely forgetting that the very presence of these flowers would have killed our mother if she were actually here to smell them. The irony was so sharp, it almost made me laugh. They were celebrating her life with the one thing that symbolized her suffocation. I pushed past the floral arrangements and entered the sanctuary. The space was cavernous, bathed in theatrical purple lighting that gave the room a nightclub atmosphere rather than a somber reverence. A giant screen behind the altar projected a slideshow of photos, but even the photos were selected with narcissism in mind. Every single picture featured Bianca front and center, with Mom blurred in the background or standing off to the side. It was a montage of Bianca's life, with Mom serving merely as a prop. And then I saw Brad. My brother-in-law was standing near the welcome table, but he was not greeting guests or accepting condolences. He was holding his phone up at a 45-degree angle, the ring light attached to the case illuminating his face in a ghostly glow. He was live streaming. I moved closer, staying just out of his frame, and listened to his performance. "Hey guys, thanks for tuning in, Brad," whispered loudly into the microphone, his face contorted into a practiced mask of grief. "It is a tough day for the Wilson family. We are just devastated, but we are staying strong." I pinned the GoFundMe link in the chat. Anything helps, guys. Funeral costs are insane, and we want to give Mom the send-off she deserves. Drop a heart in the chat if you are praying for us. I looked at the table beside him. There was a framed QR code next to the guest book with the caption, "In lieu of flowers, please donate to the Memorial Fund." I pulled out my phone and scanned the code just to see where it led. It did not go to a charity. It did not go to a medical research fund. It linked directly to a generic PayPal account that I recognized from my audit of Brad's finances. It was the same account he used to buy cryptocurrency. He was literally crowdsourcing his gambling money over an empty urn. The guests were beginning to fill the pews, but I did not recognize half of them. These were not Mom's friends from the library or her garden club. These were strangers in expensive suits, women in designer black dresses who looked like they were attending a Fashion Week after-party. I realized with a jolt that Brad and Bianca had turned our mother's funeral into a networking event. They had invited their social climbing circle, using the tragedy as a pretext to be seen. The level of disrespect was breathless. I tightened my grip on the leather handle of my briefcase. They wanted a show. They wanted drama. They wanted money. Well, I was about to give them a performance that would go viral for a very different reason. I adjusted my jacket, took a deep breath of the lily-scented poison air, and began my long walk down the center aisle. The heavy oak doors of St. Jude's Cathedral groaned open, the sound cutting through the hushed murmurs of the congregation like a thunderclap. Every head turned. Every whisper died. The silence that followed was so absolute it felt heavy, pressing down on the room like a physical weight. I stood framed in the doorway, the morning light spilling in behind me, creating a silhouette that no one in that room could ignore. I was not wearing black. I was not wearing navy. I was wearing a structural tailored dress in the shade of crimson, so vibrant it looked like fresh blood against the stark white of the lilies. I took my first step, and the sound of my stiletto heel striking the marble floor echoed through the cavernous space. Click, click, click. The rhythm was steady, unhurried, and unapologetic. To the uninitiated, my outfit was a scandalous breach of etiquette, a slap in the face to tradition. But for those who actually knew my mother, they would have recognized the shade immediately. It was her power color. It was the color of the lipstick she wore when she closed a deal, the color of the roses she planted every spring. I was not walking in as a mourner. I was walking in as a living testament to the woman they were trying to erase. As I advanced down the aisle, I saw the reaction ripple through the pews. In the front row, the self-appointed council of church mothers led by the formidable Mrs. Jenkins nearly dropped their fans. Their wide-brimmed hats, which looked like elaborate ships sailing on a sea of judgment, bobbed furiously as they leaned in to whisper. I could read their lips perfectly. Disrespectful, Jezebel. No home training. Mrs. Jenkins clutched her pearl necklace as if my very presence was sucking the oxygen out of the room. They saw a daughter mocking the dead. They did not realize they were looking at the only person in the room who was actually protecting the living. Bianca reacted exactly as I predicted. She abandoned her post next to the empty urn, forgetting her act of the grieving, fragile daughter. She moved with a speed that defied her towering heels, practically sprinting down the center aisle to intercept me before I could reach the front. Her face, previously arranged in a mask of tragic sorrow, was now contorted with genuine, ugly rage. She stopped 2 feet in front of me, blocking my path, her chest heaving. "Are you insane?" she hissed, her voice a low, venomous scratch that barely stayed below a shout. "You show up to our mother's funeral in red. Have you lost your mind, or do you just enjoy humiliating this family? Look at you. You look like you are going to a cocktail party. Turn around and get out. Security is already on the way." I stopped and looked down at her. The contrast was striking. She was draped in layers of expensive, dramatic black lace, looking like a widow from a Gothic novel, while I stood there like a flame. I kept my face perfectly neutral, my voice smooth and loud enough for the first 3 rows to hear. "I am simply wearing Mom's favorite color, Bianca. She always said black made people look defeated. And I am not defeated today. Are you?" Bianca grabbed my arm, her nails digging into the fabric of my sleeve. "Do not play games with me, Olivia. You are making a scene. Brad is live streaming this. Do you want the whole world to see that you are a heartless monster? Give me the deed to the house, or I swear to God I will have the ushers drag you out by your hair." I gently but firmly peeled her fingers off my arm, stepping around her as if she were nothing more than a minor obstacle in the road. I did not raise my voice. I did not engage in the hair-pulling brawl she clearly wanted. That is what she expected from the ghetto trash she told everyone I was. Instead, I gave her a cold, professional smile. "I brought exactly what you asked for, sister. But I am sitting in the front. Family sits in the front." I continued walking, leaving her standing there shaking with impotent fury. The murmurs from the pews grew louder, a buzzing hive of confusion and scandal. I could feel Brad's eyes burning into me, from the altar his phone still held high, capturing every moment of my defiance for his audience. Let them stare. Let them judge. Let them think I am the villain of this story. Because when I open this briefcase, the only thing that will be read is the ink on their indictment. I had barely taken 3 steps past a fuming Bianca when a heavy, clammy hand clamped down on my bicep. It was not the fragile grip of a grieving daughter. It was the vice-like squeeze of a desperate man. I did not need to turn around to know it was Brad. He yanked me sideways, dragging me into a small, shadowed alcove beneath the choir loft, away from the prying eyes of the live stream, but still within earshot of the whispering congregation. Up close, the facade of the grieving son-in-law evaporated instantly. Brad was sweating profusely. Beads of perspiration had broken through his bronzer, collecting in the deep worry lines on his forehead. He smelled of breath mints, trying to mask the acrid scent of stale scotch. He loomed over me, using his height to intimidate, a tactic he often employed when he felt his authority slipping. "Look at you!" he sneered, his voice low and trembling with suppressed rage. "Walking in here like you own the place. This is exactly why I told Bianca not to invite you. You people just cannot help yourselves, can you? You always have to make everything about you. You have to bring that ghetto drama into a house of God." My expression did not change, but my blood ran cold. You people. There it was. The mask had slipped. For years, Brad had played the role of the colorblind, progressive ally, the man who claimed to love the culture. But the moment he lost control, the moment he felt threatened by a black woman who refused to submit to his narrative, the racism he kept buried in his subconscious rose straight to the surface. He did not see me as a sister-in-law or a professional equal. He saw me as a stereotype that needed to be managed. He reached into the inner pocket of his suit jacket, not realizing that his trembling hands were betraying his fear. He shoved a folded document against my chest. "I need you to sign this, right now, before you take a single step toward those pews. It is the transfer of the deed for the Southside property. We found a buyer who is willing to close cash today, and I am not letting your selfishness ruin this deal." I looked down at the paper, then back up at his bloodshot eyes. He was not asking. He was demanding. And beneath the arrogance, I saw the terror. The loan sharks were not just calling. They were probably sitting in the back row. He needed this asset to save his own skin, and he was using my mother's funeral as the closing table. "I am not signing anything, Brad," I said, my voice calm and level, cutting through his bluster. "Not until the will is read, not until I see the death certificate, and certainly not in a corner while you insult me." He leaned in closer, his face inches from mine, his breath hot and offensive. "Do not push me, Olivia. You think you are smart because you can balance a checkbook. I am the man of this family now. I make the decisions. If you do not sign this paper, I will make sure everyone in this church knows exactly how much of a burden you were to your mother. I will ruin your reputation before the eulogy even starts." I gently brushed his hand off my shoulder as if he were a speck of dust. "You can try, Brad," I whispered, "but be careful, you never know who is listening." I stepped around him and walked back into the light, leaving him standing in the shadows with his unsigned contract and his unraveling life. I turned away from Brad, needing to put distance between myself and his toxic desperation. I headed toward the reception tables, where guests were mingling before the service, hoping to find a glass of water. Instead, I found Aunt Sarah. If every family has a historian, Sarah was ours. But she did not record facts. She recorded rumors, embellished scandals, and curated the family narrative to suit whoever was currently in power. For the last decade, that person had been me, simply because I was the one quietly writing checks to keep the lights on in her crumbling townhouse. She was standing by the refreshments, wearing a hat so large it defied physics, holding a plastic cup filled with dark purple communion wine. When she saw me, her eyes did not light up with the gratitude of a woman whose foreclosure I had stopped 6 months ago. They narrowed with the calculation of a predator spotting wounded prey. She had clearly done the math. In her mind, Bianca was about to inherit millions while I was the disowned outcast. Sarah had switched teams before the body was even in the ground. "Olivia," she called out, her voice pitching high enough to attract the attention of the surrounding circle. I braced myself. She waddled over her floral perfume, overpowering the scent of the lilies. I see you decided to show up after all. And in that dress. Lord have mercy. She shook her head, performing shock for her audience. It is a shame your mother is not here to see how little you respect her memory. I stared at her, remembering the night she sat at my kitchen table, weeping into a paper towel, begging me for $5,000 to save her car from repossession. I remembered writing that check without asking for a single penny in interest. I barely recognized that humble woman in the arrogant figure standing before me now. "Hello, Aunt Sarah," I said evenly. "I see you managed to afford a new hat. I assume business is going well." She bristled, sensing the dig. "My business is none of your concern," she snapped, stepping closer, invading my personal space. "What is your concern is that you are upsetting Bianca. This is her day. She is the one grieving. She is the one carrying the burden of this family. You are just a guest, a very rude guest." And then it happened. It was not a stumble. It was not a collision. I watched her wrist turn. I watched her eyes lock onto the silk of my bodice. With a theatrical gasp, she tipped the cup forward. The dark purple liquid splashed across the front of my crimson dress, soaking into the fabric, instantly creating a stain that looked like a fresh, jagged wound. "Oh," she cried out, her hand flying to her mouth in a pantomime of surprise that wouldn't have fooled a toddler. "Look at what I did. I am so clumsy. But maybe it is a blessing in disguise, Olivia. Now you have a reason to leave and go put on something decent." Maybe God did not like that dress either. A few people in the crowd giggled. Bianca, watching from the front row, smirked openly. My chest burned not from the cold wine, but from the sheer audacity of the betrayal. I looked down at the stain, then slowly back up at Sarah. I did not retreat. I did not cry. I stepped forward until I was whispering directly into her ear. "That is fine, Sarah," I said, my voice ice cold. "Accidents happen. Just like it was an accident when you forgot to mention this check I gave you to the IRS. But do not worry. I am sure Bianca will be happy to cover your next mortgage payment when I stop the automatic transfer tomorrow morning. Enjoy the funeral, Auntie." I watched the color drain from her face faster than the wine had hit my dress. I walked past her, head held high, the stain on my chest serving not as a mark of shame, but as a badge of battle. I was done being the savior. It was time to be the executioner. The organist played a soft, mournful chord as Bianca ascended the steps to the pulpit. She paused halfway, clutching the railing as if overcome with grief, waiting for the ushers to rush forward to support her. It was a masterclass in physical comedy, but the congregation ate it up. A collective sigh of sympathy rippled through the sanctuary. When she finally reached the microphone, she stood silent for a long minute, letting the anticipation build until the silence was heavy enough to suffocate us all. "I do not know if I can do this," she whispered into the mic, her voice trembling just enough to be audible over the speakers, but distinct enough to carry to the back of the room. "Take your time, baby," Mrs. Jenkins shouted from the front row, waving her fan vigorously. "We are here with you." Bianca dabbed at her dry eyes with a lace handkerchief that probably cost more than my mother's monthly grocery budget. She took a deep, shuddering breath and began. "Mama was not just my mother. She was my best friend, my confidant, my heart." I sat in the third row, rigid as a stone, watching the performance with clinical detachment. Best friend. The last time Bianca had a meaningful conversation with Mom was 3 years ago, and it ended with her screaming that Mom was a selfish old witch for refusing to refinance the house to fund Brad's latest investment opportunity. "These last few months have been the hardest of my life," Bianca continued, growing more confident in her fabrication. "When Mom got sick, I knew I had to make a choice. I could continue with my art gallery career, or I could be the daughter she needed. It was not even a question. I put everything on hold. I moved into her room. I spent every night by her bedside. Lies. Pure, unadulterated fiction. Bianca had not spent a single night at the house in 6 months. The art gallery career she mentioned was a 2-month stint as a receptionist 5 years ago. I remember feeding her soup spoon by spoon when her hands were too shaky to hold the bowl. Bianca sobbed, looking up toward the ceiling as if seeking divine witness. I remember changing her sheets, brushing her hair, singing the old gospel songs she loved. It was exhausting. Lord knows it was exhausting, but it was an honor. I would give anything to feed her one last bowl of soup today. My grip tightened around the silver ballpoint pen in my lap. It looked like an expensive writing instrument, a gift a corporate executive might receive. In reality, it was a high-fidelity audio recorder with a unidirectional microphone capable of capturing a whisper from 30 feet away. I had clicked it on the moment she walked up the stairs. Every word she was saying was being digitized and stored. This was not just for my personal archives. This was evidence. By claiming she provided full-time care, she was establishing a narrative to justify the changes to the will she was about to present, changes that supposedly rewarded her sacrifice. In the eyes of the law, she was establishing a fraudulent basis for inheritance under oath in front of witnesses. She told me at the end, Bianca said, dropping her voice to a dramatic whisper that forced everyone to lean forward. She said, "Bianca, you are the only one who truly loves me. You are the only one who stayed." And that broke my heart, because I know how much she wanted everyone to be there. She cast a fleeting, sorrowful glance in my direction. The church turned to look at me, the absent daughter. The judgment was palpable, a physical wave of heat. They believed her. They believed the tears, the shaking shoulders, the story of the soup. They did not know that while Bianca claimed to be spoon-feeding Mom, Mom was actually alone in room 302 praying for a glass of water. I did not look down. I did not defend myself. I stared straight at Bianca, my finger resting gently on the top of the pen, ensuring the recording was capturing every syllable. "Keep talking, sister," I thought. "Dig the hole deeper. You are not just lying to God, you are lying to the federal record." The reception was held in the church's banquet hall, a space that had been decorated with the same aggressive opulence as the sanctuary. Crystal chandeliers hung low over round tables draped in heavy white linen, and centerpieces of white roses and hydrangeas were so large they blocked the view across the room. I walked past the elevated head table where gold-rimmed plates and crystal stemware awaited the immediate family. Naturally, there was no place setting for me there. I did not have to search long to find my exile. I found my name card written in hasty smeared ink on a small, wobbly folding table pushed into the farthest, darkest corner of the room. It was not just the back of the room, it was the service station. To my immediate left were the swinging double doors of the kitchen, which burst open every 30 seconds with a crash of dishes and shouting staff. To my right was the entrance to the men's restroom, the door propped slightly open by a trash can, allowing the faint chemical smell of urinal cakes to drift over my dining area. My table companions were not relatives, neighbors, or even distant acquaintances. I was seated with the organist, who was busy scrolling through a dating app on his phone, and two members of the setup crew who were on their break. This was Bianca's petty way of telling me exactly where I stood in her new world order. I was not family, I was staff. I was refuse. I was something to be hidden away in the corner so I would not ruin the aesthetic of her perfect, profitable tragedy. A waiter, looking harried and annoyed, dropped a bowl of soup in front of me without stopping. I looked down at the lobster bisque. It was stone cold. A thick orange film of congealed grease had already formed on the surface, creating a skin that wrinkled when I tilted the bowl. I did not reach for my spoon. Instead, I looked up across the sea of guests to the head table, bathed in the warm, flattering glow of a dedicated spotlight. The contrast was nauseating. At the VIP table, the servers were pouring piping hot soup from silver tureens. Waiters were topping off champagne flutes with Dom Perignon, a vintage my mother would have considered a wasteful extravagance. But it was the behavior of the grieving couple that made my stomach turn more than the cold soup ever could. Bianca and Brad were not mourning. They were holding court. They were laughing. Not the soft, reminiscent chuckles of people sharing fond memories of the deceased, but loud, boisterous, open-mouthed laughter. Brad was leaning back in his chair, a cigar already unlit in his hand, high-fiving one of his crypto investor buddies. Bianca was accepting condolences like a celebrity accepting awards, basking in the attention, her hand resting possessively on Brad's arm. They looked like they were at a wedding rehearsal dinner, or perhaps a victory party. And in their minds, that is exactly what this was. They were celebrating the jackpot. I picked up my phone, but not to text them. I zoomed in with my camera, capturing a high-definition video of them toasting with champagne, while our mother's empty chair sat symbolic and ignored. I panned down to my congealed soup, then over to the bathroom door next to my shoulder. I was documenting the indignity. Every laugh, every cold spoonful, every insult was being catalogued. They thought they were shaming me by putting me by the toilets. They did not realize they were giving me the perfect vantage point to watch them hang themselves. As I pushed the bowl of congealed bisque away, the swinging door to the kitchen flew open again. A server emerged, balancing a heavy pitcher of ice water. She moved with a deliberate, tense energy that caught my attention. As she approached my exile table in the corner, I recognized her eyes immediately. It was Keisha. 5 years ago, she had been the janitor at my accounting firm, and I had helped her file the paperwork to reclaim wage theft from a dishonest subcontractor. I had not seen her since, but she clearly remembered me. She did not smile. In a room full of people pretending to mourn, she was the only one looking at me with genuine concern. She began filling my glass, leaning in close enough that her braided hair brushed against my shoulder. The noise of the room, the raucous laughter from the head table, and the clinking of silverware provided a perfect cover for her whisper. "Watch your back, Ms. Wilson," she murmured, her voice barely audible over the hum of the ventilation system. "He is not planning to stay for the reception." I kept my expression neutral, picking up my napkin as if to wipe my mouth. "What did you hear, Keisha?" She glanced nervously toward the head table where Brad was currently holding court, a champagne flute in one hand and his phone in the other. "He was on the phone in the back corridor near the loading dock about 10 minutes ago," she whispered, pouring water into the empty glass of the organist, who was still ignored beside me. "He thought he was alone. He was shouting at a travel agent. He booked a seat on the 11 o'clock flight to Grand Cayman tonight. One way. He said he does not care what it costs, he just needs to be wheels up before midnight." She finished pouring the water and slid a small folded piece of paper under the rim of my bread plate. "It is the flight number," she said. I wrote it down. "Do not let him get away with it. You were the only one who ever treated me like a human being." She turned and walked away before I could thank her, disappearing back into the chaos of the kitchen. I slid the paper into my lap and unfolded it. Flight 702. Depart Chicago O'Hare at 2300 hours. Destination Georgetown, Cayman Islands. The puzzle pieces clicked into place with a satisfying, terrifying precision. The rush to hold the funeral today, the pressure to sign the deed immediately, the liquidation of the assets. Brad was not just trying to pay off debts, he was cashing out. He was planning to take the life insurance payout, the money from the house sale, and whatever else he could steal from the estate and vanish into a tropical tax haven while leaving Bianca behind to deal with the fallout. I looked across the room at my sister. She was gazing at Brad with adoration, completely unaware that she was just a pawn in his exit strategy. He was going to leave her bankrupt, homeless, and likely facing charges for the fraud he orchestrated. For a split second, I felt a pang of pity. But then I remembered the cold soup. I remembered the nursing home. I remembered the text message telling me I was unwanted. Pity is a luxury I could not afford. Brad was running on a deadline, which meant I had to accelerate my timeline. I checked my watch. The lawyer would be here any minute. It was time to close the net. The double doors swung open with a violent thud, causing the entire room to jump. But it was not the police, and it certainly was not a divine intervention. It was a man who looked like he had slept in his car. This was Saul, the legal representation Brad had scraped from the bottom of the barrel. I had researched him the moment his name appeared on the preliminary filings. Saul operated out of a strip mall office next to a laundromat and had a 2-star rating on Google, mostly from clients complaining that he lost their paperwork. He stumbled into the banquet hall clutching a battered faux leather briefcase that looked like it had survived a war zone. His gray suit was ill-fitting, the polyester fabric shining under the chandeliers, and his tie was loosened at the collar, revealing a stain that was disturbingly yellow. As he passed my table in the corner, a waft of air followed him. It was a pungent cocktail of cheap cologne, stale cigarette smoke, and the unmistakable sharp tang of gin. It was 10 in the morning, and the family attorney was already intoxicated. Brad, however, looked at this disheveled mess of a man as if he were a knight in shining armor. He practically sprinted from the head table, nearly knocking over a waiter to reach him. There was no handshake, no professional greeting. Brad grabbed Saul by the shoulder, his fingers digging into the cheap fabric of the jacket, and whispered furiously into his ear. Saul nodded vigorously, wiping sweat from his forehead with a crumpled napkin he pulled from his pocket. The room had fallen into a confused murmur. The organist, sensing the tension, had started playing a soft, awkward interlude, trying to cover the bizarre scene unfolding near the entrance. But Brad was done with pleasantries. He was done with the act. The clock was ticking toward his flight to the Caymans, and he had no intention of wasting another minute on mourning. He turned to the room, his face flushed red, and clapped his hands together with a sound that cracked like a whip. "Cut the music!" He bellowed, his voice cracking with desperation. "Kill it! Now!" The organist froze, his hands hovering over the keys. The silence that crashed down was absolute. Brad marched to the center of the room, dragging the bewildered Saul behind him like a prop. He grabbed the microphone stand and yanked it down to his height. "Ladies and gentlemen, I know this is unorthodox," Brad announced, his eyes darting around the room, avoiding mine. "But Mom, Beatrice, she was a practical woman. She would not want us dragging this out. She would want us to settle her affairs and move on. So instead of waiting for a private reading next week, we are going to honor her wishes right here, right now." He shoved the microphone into Saul's chest. "Read it, Saul. Read the will. Tell them who owns the house. Tell them who gets the money. And make it loud." A gasp rippled through the crowd. Reading a will at a funeral reception was not just tacky, it was unheard of. It was a violation of every social norm in our community. But Brad did not care about norms. He cared about liquidity. He needed that house deed signed, sealed, and delivered before the bank closed. I sat back in my chair, swirling my ice water, and watched the train wreck begin. Saul fumbled with the latches of his briefcase, his hands shaking. He was about to read a document that would seal his own fate. Saul cleared his throat, a wet, guttural sound that was amplified by the microphone, causing several guests to wince. He adjusted his glasses, which were sliding down his sweaty nose, and held the document with trembling hands. The paper rattled audibly, betraying his nerves. He began to read, his voice monotone and rushing, as if he wanted to get the words out before the police arrived. "I, Beatrice Wilson, being of sound mind and body, do hereby declare this to be my last will and testament, revoking all prior wills and codicils." He paused to wipe his forehead with his sleeve. I watched him closely. The legal jargon was standard, but the delivery was that of a man holding a grenade with the pin pulled. Brad stood behind him, arms crossed, nodding along like a conductor guiding an orchestra. Bianca dabbed at her dry eyes, ready to accept her windfall with practiced humility. "To my daughter, Bianca Wilson Miller, who has been my constant companion and caretaker in my final days, I leave the entirety of my estate. This includes, but is not limited to, the family home in Oakbrook, the brownstone property on the south side, all contents of my safety deposit boxes, and the full payout of my life insurance policy." A murmur rippled through the room. Even the social climbers and crypto bros knew this was unusual. To leave everything to one child while the other sat 10 feet away was a declaration of war. But Saul was not finished. He licked his lips and squinted at the bottom of the page. "To my daughter Olivia Wilson," he mumbled, his voice dropping an octave. I leave my collection of family photo albums stored in the attic. It is my hope that looking at these pictures will remind her of the family she chose to distance herself from. The silence that followed was heavy enough to crush bones. It was absolute. The insult was so precise, so petty that it sucked the air out of the room. Photo albums. They were leaving me cardboard and dust while they took millions. Bianca turned to look at me, a smirk playing on her lips, waiting for me to cry, to scream, to storm out in a fit of rage. She wanted the satisfaction of seeing me broken. Instead, I threw my head back and laughed. It was not a polite chuckle. It was a full-bodied, genuine laugh that echoed off the vaulted ceiling of the banquet hall. I laughed until my sides hurt. I laughed because the audacity was so breathtakingly stupid. The entire room turned to stare at me as if I had lost my mind. The organist stopped scrolling on his phone. The waiters froze with their trays. Brad stepped forward, his face turning a dangerous shade of purple. "You think this is funny?" he shouted into the microphone. "Your mother is dead and you are laughing. You are sick." I wiped a tear of mirth from my eye and stood up, smoothing the front of my red dress. "I am not laughing at Mom, Brad. I am laughing at you. Because I know exactly when that document was created. And I know for a fact that Mom did not write it. You see, Mom hates the word codicil. She thinks it sounds pretentious. And she certainly would never leave me the photo albums. Do you know why?" I stepped out from behind the table, walking slowly toward the center of the room. "Because Mom is blind in her left eye, Brad. She has not looked at a photo album in 10 years. She listens to audiobooks. If she had written that, well, she would have left me her Audible account. But you would not know that, would you? You were too busy trying to steal her money to ever actually talk to her." The room went deadly quiet again. I saw a flicker of doubt cross Saul's face. He looked down at the paper in his hands, then back at Brad. The narrative was cracking. And I was just getting started. The laughter had barely faded from my lips when the atmosphere shifted from awkward to dangerous. Saul, sweating profusely, now thrust a clipboard towards me. The document clipped to it wasn't the will. It was a single-page waiver, a legal instrument designed to strip me of any right to contest the estate, sue the executor, or request an independent audit. It was a gag order disguised as a formality. "Sign it," Brad growled, stepping out from behind the head table. He moved with the aggressive, jerky energy of a man whose time was running out. "Sign it so we can all go home and grieve in peace. Do not make this harder than it needs to be, Olivia." I looked down at the paper. It was poorly drafted, likely typed up in Saul's car 10 minutes ago, but the intent was clear. If I signed this, I waived my right to see the death certificate. I waived my right to question the bank transfers. It was the final lock on the cage they thought they had built for me. "I am not signing this, Brad," I said, keeping my voice calm, but projecting it clearly so the entire room could hear. "This document is illegal. You cannot force a beneficiary to waive their rights before the will has even been filed with the probate court. And frankly, Saul, I am surprised you would even present this. Do you want to be disbarred today, or were you planning to wait until Monday?" Saul flinched, pulling the clipboard back slightly. But Brad was past the point of legal nuances. He snapped. The veneer of the grieving son-in-law shattered completely. He marched across the room, knocking over a vase of white roses as he came. The water splashed onto the floor, but he didn't stop until he was standing directly over me at my small exiled table. He slammed his hand down on the table so hard that the bowl of cold soup jumped. "Sign the paper, Olivia!" he screamed, veins bulging in his neck. "I am sick of your arrogance. You think you are better than us. You think you are smart. You are nothing. You are a bitter, lonely woman who no one loves. Mom hated you. She told me every day how much she hated you. Now sign the damn paper." The room gasped. Even the church mothers in the front row looked scandalized. Brad raised his hand, not to hit the table this time, but as if he were about to strike me. Bianca stood up, not to stop him, but to watch. I didn't flinch. I didn't cower. I looked him dead in the eye and saw the fear behind the rage. He was terrified. He knew that if I walked out of there without signing, his flight to the Caymans was cancelled. Go ahead, Brad, I whispered, leaning forward. Hit me. Do it in front of 100 witnesses. Add assault to the list of felonies you are committing today. It will make the prison sentence so much longer. His hand hovered in the air, trembling. The silence in the room was deafening. He was on the edge of a cliff, and I was daring him to jump. I did not scream. I did not flinch. I did not call for security. Instead, I calmly reached into my clutch and pulled out my smartphone. The screen was already unlocked, the casting app open and waiting. Brad was still looming over me. His hand raised, his face twisted in a rictus of rage, expecting me to crumble. He was so focused on intimidation that he did not notice the large projection screen behind the altar flickering to life. Wait, I said, my voice cutting through the tension like a razor. I will sign your paper, Brad, but before I do, I think it is only fair that everyone here understands exactly what I am waiving my rights to. You want us to celebrate Mom's legacy? Let's look at the legacy you have built in her name. I tapped the screen of my phone. The AirPlay connection engaged instantly. Behind Brad, the massive screen that had been displaying a loop of Mom's photos suddenly went black. A collective gasp rippled through the room as the image changed. It was not a photo. It was a live feed of my phone screen, crisp and high definition in the dim church lighting. Brad turned around slowly, confused by the sudden shift in the room's attention. "What are you doing?" he stammered, his hand lowering. I stood up, smoothing my red dress, and walked past him toward the center aisle. "I am doing what I do best, Brad. I am auditing you." I swiped left on my phone. The screen behind me filled with a complex, colorful spreadsheet. To the uninitiated, it looked like boring data. To the investors in the room, it was a horror show. Rows of red numbers cascaded down the screen, dates and transaction IDs highlighted in yellow. "This," I announced, pointing to the screen, "is the financial health of the Wilson family estate as of this morning, or rather the lack thereof." Brad's face drained of color. He lunged toward the AV booth. "Turn it off!" he screamed at the terrified sound guy. "Cut the feed! Sit down!" "Brad," Mrs. Jenkins yelled from the front row, her curiosity finally outweighing her decorum. "We want to see—" I continued, my voice steady and amplified by the acoustics of the hall. "You see, Brad here has been very busy. While he was supposedly managing Mom's finances, he was actually managing a very different portfolio." I swiped again. The screen changed to a graph showing a steep, jagged decline. "This is the account linked to Crypto King 88. Does that handle sound familiar to anyone?" I looked directly at the table of Brad's friends. They shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Brad froze. He looked at Bianca, then at me, realizing he was naked in front of the very people he tried to impress. "You wanted me to sign a waiver to protect the estate?" I asked, taking a step closer to him. "There is no estate to protect, Brad, because you spent it all. And before I sign anything, I think the congregation deserves to see exactly where the money went. Shall we look at the transaction history?" I hovered my finger over the next slide. The silence in the room was electric. The predator had become the prey, and the entire church was watching the kill. I pointed to the steep downward trajectory of the red line on the projection screen. It looked like a cliff, and in financial terms, that is exactly what it was. The silence in the banquet hall was no longer stunned. It was horrified. Everyone from the church mothers in the front row to the catering staff in the back was staring at the visual representation of a fortune evaporating. "That red line represents $500,000, I explained, my voice echoing clearly through the sound system. $500,000. That was the liquidity Mom kept in the primary trust account. It was meant for property taxes, maintenance, and emergency medical bills. But as you can see, starting 6 months ago, there were a series of wire transfers to an exchange called Bit Global." I tapped the screen again, zooming in on the transaction list. The names of the recipients were not doctors or contractors. They were obscure alphanumeric wallet addresses. Brad tried to lunge for the laptop connecting to the projector, but two of the larger ushers, realizing the tide had turned, stepped in his way. They crossed their arms, blocking his path. The church security was no longer protecting the grieving family. They were protecting the truth. Brad did not invest in a diverse portfolio. I continued walking slowly toward the head table. He gambled it all on speculative altcoins that crashed 3 weeks ago. The money is gone. All of it. The trust account balance as of this morning is negative $400 due to overdraft fees. Bianca stood up slowly, her hands trembling by her sides. Her face, usually a mask of perfectly applied foundation and arrogance, was ashen. She looked at the screen, then at her husband. "Brad," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Tell me that is a mistake. Tell me you did not touch the trust. That money was for the renovation." But I was not done. I swiped left again. A scanned document appeared on the screen. It was a home equity line of credit signed and notarized. "You might want to sit down for this part, Bianca," I said, my tone dropping to a deadly serious register. Because the trust fund was not enough to cover his losses. When the market dipped, Brad needed more capital to try and win it back. So he leveraged the only asset he had access to. I pointed to the signature at the bottom of the document. "This is a second mortgage on your home in Oak Brook. The house you claim is the jewel of the family estate. Brad forged your signature to take out a $300,000 loan against it. And since he has missed the last 3 payments, the bank initiated foreclosure proceedings yesterday." The sound that escaped Bianca's throat was a strangled, high-pitched keen. She looked at Brad with eyes wide with betrayal. "You mortgaged my house!" she screamed, the sound tearing through the hall. "You told me it was paid off. You told me we were debt-free." Brad held up his hands, backing away from her. "It was a sure thing, babe. It was a leverage play. I was going to double it and pay it back before you even knew. The market just moved too fast." "You do not own that house anymore, Bianca," I interjected, driving the final nail into the coffin. "You are technically squatting. And unless you have $300,000 in cash in your purse right now, the sheriff will be putting a padlock on your front door by Monday morning." The room erupted. The veneer of wealth, the illusion of the successful golden child and her brilliant husband, dissolved instantly. They were not rich heirs. They were destitute frauds. And I was just getting started with the dissection. The room was already spinning from the revelation of the foreclosure, but I was not done. I tapped my phone screen one more time, swiping away the sterile bank documents to reveal something far more visceral. The projection screen behind the altar shifted to a screenshot of a text message thread. The background was dark mode, the interface clearly belonging to an encrypted messaging app preferred by criminals. The contact name at the top simply read, "The Collection." "If you think losing your home is rock bottom, you are mistaken," I said, my voice cutting through the murmurs like a knife. "Banks are bureaucratic. They send letters. They follow procedures. But when the banks cut Brad off 3 months ago, he did not stop gambling. He just went to a different kind of lender." I pointed to the timestamp on the last message. It was received at 4:03 a.m. this morning, just 2 hours after Bianca called me to announce our mother's death. I turned to look at my sister, whose face was already pale but was about to turn ghostly white. "You need to read this, Bianca. You need to see exactly what your husband thinks you are worth." I read the text message aloud, letting every brutal word hang in the air. "Brad, do not ghost us. You have until midnight tonight. If I do not see 50,000 in my wallet, my boys are going to stop by the house in Oak Brook. And since you like to hide, we will take the payment out of your wife instead." She looks soft. I bet she breaks easy. A collective gasp of pure horror sucked the oxygen out of the room. This was not financial fraud anymore. This was a death threat. Bianca stared at the screen, her eyes wide and unblinking, her mouth opening and closing without sound. The realization crashed over her like a tidal wave. She was not the beneficiary of a fortune. She was the collateral for a debt. I took a step closer to the head table. "Do you understand now, Bianca? Do you understand why he needed the funeral today? Do you understand why he is trying to flee to the Caymans tonight? He is not taking you on a vacation. He is escaping. And he is leaving you here in a foreclosed house to face the men who sent that message. He sold you out to save his own skin." Brad let out a guttural roar, abandoning all pretense of civilization. He lunged across the table, scattering crystal glasses and silverware, desperate to stop the truth from bleeding out. "That is a lie," he screamed, his eyes wild and bloodshot. "She faked that. That is Photoshop. I would never hurt her." But Bianca flinched away from him as if he were radioactive. She scrambled backward in her chair, knocking it over with a loud clatter. She looked at the man she had idolized for years, and finally saw the monster beneath the suit. She saw the sweat on his brow, the terror in his eyes, and she knew the text was real. She knew, because she had seen the strange cars parked down the street from their house for weeks. She had seen him looking out the blinds at 3 in the morning. For the first time in her life, the golden child looked at me not with contempt, but with terrified pleading. I did not soften. I stood my ground, letting the projector beam the evidence of her husband's betrayal directly onto her face. The trap was not just about money anymore. It was about survival. And Brad was running out of time. If financial ruin is not enough to break a marriage, perhaps total humiliation will do the trick. I watched the color drain from Bianca's face as she processed the death threat from the loan shark, but I could see her mind working. She was calculating. She was thinking that maybe, just maybe, if they stuck together, they could lie their way out of this. She was already formulating a plan to blame everything on a gambling addiction, to play the victim card, to stand by her man. I could not allow that. I needed to sever the bond completely. I tapped the screen one last time. The ominous black text message from the loan shark vanished, replaced by a brightly lit high-resolution PDF of a credit card statement. It was Mom's Chase Sapphire Reserve account, the one she used only for emergencies. "You see, Bianca?" I said, my voice softening into a mock sympathetic tone. "Brad told you he was working late nights to manage the estate, didn't he? He told you he was meeting with specialists and lawyers. But according to Mom's credit card statement, his definition of a meeting is quite different from ours." I highlighted a series of charges dated 3 weeks ago. October 14th, the Peninsula Hotel in downtown Chicago. Presidential suite. Room service for 2. 3 bottles of Cristal champagne. A couple's massage package. The total for a single weekend was $12,000. Bianca squinted at the screen, confusion warring with denial. "October 14th, she whispered. "That was the weekend Mom had the seizure. You told me you were at the hospital meeting with the neurologist, Brad. You said you slept in the waiting room chair." Brad was shaking his head frantically, backing away toward the altar, his hands raised in surrender. "It is not what it looks like, babe. It was a business meeting. I was wooing an investor. We needed the capital." I zoomed in on the bottom of the invoice where the guest names were listed for the hotel's security log. I read the names aloud, ensuring the microphone picked up every syllable. Registered guests, Bradley Miller and Tiffany LaCroix. The silence in the room broke. Someone in the back row let out a loud, scandalous gasp. I turned to the crowd. For those of you who do not know, Tiffany is the 22-year-old yoga instructor at the club where Brad spends his mornings. And as you can see, Brad paid for his romantic getaway using the credit card of the woman he put in a nursing home. He was funding his affair with your inheritance, Bianca. That was the breaking point. The socialite, the carefully curated image of the perfect wife, the woman who cared more about appearances than her own soul, finally snapped. It was instantaneous and violent. Bianca let out a shriek that sounded less like a human and more like a wounded animal. She did not slap him. She launched herself across the gap between them, her manicured nails aiming directly for his eyes. "You dirty liar," she screamed, tackling him into the flower arrangement. The vase shattered, sending water and white lilies flying everywhere. They crashed to the floor in a tangle of limbs and black lace. Brad tried to push her off, but she was fueled by the rage of a woman who had just realized her entire life was a lie. She clawed at his face, ripping his shirt, screaming obscenities that would make a sailor blush. The church mothers jumped up, clutching their pearls. The videographer who Brad had hired to document the funeral was now zooming in on the brawl, capturing every second of the destruction. I stood calmly by the projector watching the chaos I had orchestrated. The alliance was broken, the family was destroyed, and I hadn't even played my ace card yet. The physical altercation between my sister and her husband was entertaining, but it was merely a distraction from the main event. While Bianca was still sobbing into her hands and Brad was wiping blood from a scratch on his cheek, I tapped my phone screen again. The humiliating hotel invoice vanished, replaced by a high-resolution scan of the last will and testament that Saul had been clutching just moments ago. "I am glad we cleared up the infidelity," I said, my voice cutting through the sounds of Bianca's weeping. "But now we need to address the felony. I want everyone to look at the signature block on page 3 of this document." I used 2 fingers to zoom in on the projection screen until the signature Beatrice Wilson was 5 feet tall behind me. It was elegant, sweeping, and perfectly legible. The loops on the B and W were artistic flourishes. To the untrained eye, it looked like a valid endorsement. To a forensic accountant, it looked like a smoking gun. Now let's look at reality. I swiped the screen to split the view. On the left was the will. On the right was a check my mother had written to the electric company 2 months prior. The difference was not just noticeable. It was heartbreaking. The signature on the check was jagged. The lines were shaky, filled with microscopic hesitations where the pen had rested too long on the paper. The letters were cramped, struggling to stay on the line. For those of you who actually visited Mom in the last year, you know she developed essential tremors in her right hand. I explained, walking over to the screen and pointing at the shaky check. It was a neurological condition. Holding a pen was painful for her. She could barely sign her name without stabilizing her right hand with her left. Her muscle control was deteriorating. I turned back to the room, pointing a damning finger at the signature on the will. But this signature on the left, this is a masterpiece of motor control. Look at the fluidity of the curves. Look at the consistent pen pressure. There are no tremors, no hesitations, no stops. This was written by a hand that was steady, confident, and strong. I walked slowly toward Brad, who was now leaning against the altar railing, looking like a cornered rat. "You made a classic amateur mistake, Brad. You tried to make it look too perfect. You thought making it legible would make it more official, but in doing so, you proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that Beatrice Wilson never touched this paper." Saul, the lawyer, was frantically stuffing papers back into his briefcase, realizing he had just facilitated a major crime. But I kept my eyes on my brother-in-law. "I have a question for you, Brad, and remember, the recording is still running. How many times did you practice signing Mom's name? Did you sit at her kitchen table while she was sleeping in the next room? Did you fill up pages of legal pads, trying to get that loop on the W just right? Because forensic document examination calls this simulation. I call it forgery in the first degree. And in the state of Illinois, that carries a sentence of up to 5 years per count. And Brad, I count at least 10 documents in this file. Do the math." Brad looked like a man trying to hold back a tidal wave with a paper umbrella. The forgery accusation was damaging, but I could see the frantic calculations continuing behind his panicked eyes. He was thinking that even if the will was contested, even if the house was foreclosed, he still had the Holy Grail. He was banking on the life insurance policy. In his mind, that $2 million was guaranteed a contract between him and a massive insurance conglomerate that did not care about family squabbles. I took a step back, giving the projector screen full command of the room. I tapped the phone one last time. The image of the forged signature vanished, replaced by a simple scanned letter on official letterhead from St. Jude's Children's Research Hospital. "You are holding on to one last hope, aren't you, Brad?" I asked softly. "You are thinking about that $2 million payout. You are thinking that is your ticket to the Caymans. You are thinking that no matter what I prove about the bank accounts, the insurance company has to pay out upon proof of death." Brad wiped sweat from his upper lip, his breathing shallow and rapid. "That is right," he stammered, trying to regain some shred of bravado. "That policy is ironclad. I am the beneficiary. Mom wanted me to have it to take care of Bianca." I shook my head slowly, looking at him with something almost like pity. It was ironclad Brad. Until 6 months ago. You see, when Mom realized she was losing control of her hands, she started thinking about her legacy. She sat down with me and we reviewed her assets. She decided that $2 million was too much money to leave to a daughter who never visited, and a son-in-law who looked at her like a walking ATM. I pointed to the screen. Mom surrendered the policy, Brad. She cashed it out. She took the cash value and donated every single cent to the pediatric cancer wing at St. Jude's. She established the Beatrice Wilson Grant for underprivileged families. The policy you are waiting for, it does not exist. It has a balance of 0. The sound that came out of Brad was not human. It was the sound of a trapped animal realizing the cage door has been welded shut. His face went from pale to a dangerous mottling red. The veins in his neck bulged as the reality of his situation crashed down on him. No money, no house, no escape. And the loan sharks were watching the clock. "You lie!" he screamed, his voice cracking into a high-pitched shriek. "You are lying. I checked the paperwork. I saw the policy in the filing cabinet." "That was an old copy, Brad," I replied calmly. "You would know that if you ever actually helped her with her mail, instead of just stealing from it." He lunged forward, grabbing the microphone stand and shaking it violently. "I earned that money. I put in the time. I dealt with her, complaining I was the one who made the hard choices." And then in his blind fury, the truth slipped out. The filter between his brain and his mouth dissolved under the pressure of total financial collapse. "I did what had to be done," he roared, spit flying from his mouth. "I pulled the plug when no one else had the guts to do it. I mean, I helped her pass. I was there until the end." The silence that followed was instant and absolute. It was heavy, suffocating, and terrifying. The organist stopped breathing. The church mothers froze. Even Bianca, who was still on the floor amidst the broken lilies, looked up at her husband with wide, horrified eyes. He had just admitted in front of 200 witnesses and a live-stream audience that he had taken an active role in ending a life he thought was worth $2 million. Brad froze, realizing what he had just screamed. He looked around the room, seeing the shock on every face. He opened his mouth to take it back, to spin it to lie. But it was too late. The words were out, and the recording was still running. The echo of Brad's confession hung in the air like a noxious gas choking the life out of the room. I pulled the plug. The words seemed to reverberate off the stained glass, bouncing back to hit him in the face with the force of a physical blow. He stood frozen, his mouth still open, his chest heaving as the realization of what he had just screamed into a live microphone finally washed over him. The church was so quiet I could hear the hum of the electric candles on the altar. He started to backtrack, his hands waving frantically in front of him, as if he could physically erase the words from the air. That was a figure of speech. He stammered, his voice jumping an octave. I stopped the life support because she was suffering. It was a mercy. I was speaking metaphorically, for God's sake. You all know what I meant." He looked at Bianca for support, but she was staring at him as if he were a stranger holding a bloody knife. "You told me she died in her sleep," she whispered, her voice trembling. "You told me the nurse called you. You said you were not even in the room." Brad ignored her, spinning around to face the congregation, sweating profusely. "This is a setup. She is twisting my words. I loved that woman. I took care of her. I did not interrupt him. I let him spin. I let him dig. I waited until his frantic babbling tapered off into a breathless silence, until he was looking at me with eyes full of terror, begging me to say something that would make this nightmare stop. I picked up my phone from the table, my movements slow and deliberate. I tapped the screen once to end the screen mirroring, plunging the room back into the dim purple-hued lighting of the church. "You are right about one thing, Brad," I said, my voice calm, almost conversational. "You certainly tried to pull the plug. You signed the do not resuscitate order. You withheld her heart medication. You instructed the staff to limit her hydration. You did everything in your power to accelerate her decline because you needed that insurance payout to cover your gambling debts before the sharks came for your kneecaps. I took a step closer, holding the phone up like a torch. But you made a miscalculation. You assumed that because she was old, she was stupid. You assumed that because she was frail, she was helpless. And most importantly, you assumed she was actually dead. Brad blinked, confusion warring with his panic. What are you talking about? I smiled, a cold, sharp expression that held no warmth. I looked down at the phone in my hand where the call timer was still ticking upward. The speakerphone icon was glowing green. Thank you for confirming the timeline and the motive, Brad, I said, speaking clearly into the device. That was the final piece of evidence we needed for the attempted murder charge. I paused, looking him dead in the eye. Mom, did you hear all that? The room held its breath. From the small speaker of my phone, magnified by the silence of the hall, came a voice. It was weak, yes, and raspy from weeks of neglect, but it was unmistakably the voice of Beatrice Wilson. I heard him, Olivia. I heard every word. And to think I used to cook that boy Sunday dinner. Brad's knees buckled. He grabbed the edge of the altar rail to keep from collapsing. Bianca let out a scream of pure, unadulterated shock. The ghost had just spoken and she was very much alive. The sound was rhythmic and deliberate. It cut through the stunned silence of the banquet hall, like a gavel striking a judge's bench. Thud, thud, thud. It was the heavy, authoritative impact of a mahogany cane hitting the marble floor. Everyone turned. The collective gaze of the room shifted from the trembling figure of Brad at the altar to the double doors at the back of the sanctuary. Slowly, majestically, the doors swung inward. The bright midday sun poured into the dim purple-lit room, blinding us for a moment. As our eyes adjusted, the silhouette resolved into a figure that made Bianca gasp for air. Standing there was not a ghost. It was not a frail, bedridden invalid gasping for her final breath. It was Beatrice Wilson, and she looked magnificent. She was dressed in a tailored cream pantsuit that fit her perfectly, a sharp contrast to the hospital gown Brad had described in his lies. Her silver hair was coiffed into an elegant bun, and on her lips was a shade of red that matched my dress exactly. She stood tall, her posture regal and unyielding. The cane in her right hand was clearly more of an accessory for dramatic effect than a necessity for walking. She looked vibrant, she looked powerful, she looked alive, but she was not alone. Flanking her on the left was Chief Miller, the head of the Chicago Police Department's Financial Crimes Division. Behind him stood two uniformed officers, their hands resting noticeably on their belts. The sight of the badges glinting in the sunlight sent a wave of cold reality through the room. This was not a family reunion. This was a raid. Brad made a sound that was somewhere between a whimper and a dry heave. He stumbled back against the communion table, knocking over a chalice. His eyes were wide, darting from the living woman he thought he had killed to the police officers who were staring him down. He looked at the exit, but the church security had already blocked the side doors. Beatrice began to walk down the central aisle. She did not rush. She moved with the slow, terrifying inevitability of karma. The crowd parted for her, instantly pressing themselves against the pews to give her a wide berth. No one dared to whisper. The only sound was the click of her heels and the rhythmic strike of the cane. She stopped 10 feet from the altar, looking first at Bianca, who was huddled on the floor, and then at Brad. Her gaze was not angry. It was disappointed, which was infinitely worse. She adjusted her glasses, the same ones Brad claimed she could not see through, and looked at her son-in-law with a clarity that pierced his soul. "Hello, Bradley," she said, her voice strong and steady, filling the cavernous room without the need for a microphone. "I believe you have something of mine, my life, and I have come to take it back." The silence that had gripped the room shattered the moment my mother opened her mouth. Her voice was not the frail whisper of the invalid Brad had described, nor was it the spectral moan of a haunting spirit. It was the sharp, commanding baritone of a woman who had taught high school mathematics for 40 years and could silence a cafeteria with a single look. "You organized a lovely funeral, Bradley," she said, her voice projecting effortlessly to the choir loft. The flowers are hideous, and I specifically told you I hate lilies, but the turnout is impressive. There is just one small logistical problem with this entire production. The guest of honor is not dead. Pandemonium erupted. It started with Aunt Sarah, who let out a blood-curdling shriek that likely shattered the wineglasses in the kitchen. "It is a ghost," she screamed, flinging her communion wine into the air as she scrambled backward over a pew. "She has come back for vengeance! Lord, save us!" Panic rippled through the congregation like a contagion. People who had been politely sipping water moments ago were now climbing over chairs to get away from the center aisle. A crypto investor in a tailored suit fainted dead away, hitting the floor with a heavy thud. The church mothers were clutching their rosaries, speaking in tongues, terrified that the judgment day had arrived ahead of schedule. Beatrice ignored them all. She did not float, she marched. She stopped right in front of the altar, looking down at the wreckage of the flower arrangement where Bianca was still trembling on the floor. Then she turned her gaze to Brad. Brad did not scream. He did not run. His brain simply could not process the visual data. He was looking at a woman he had mentally buried, a woman whose death was the cornerstone of his financial survival. The cognitive dissonance was too much for his nervous system. His face turned a color I had never seen on a human being, a mix of gray and translucent green. His eyes rolled back in his head, his knees gave way, and he collapsed. He didn't crumple gracefully. He fell like a cut tree, hitting the marble steps of the altar with a bone-jarring crack. Beatrice looked down at his unconscious form with an expression of mild distaste, as if he were a stain on her carpet. "Get up, you fool," she said, poking his shoulder with the rubber tip of her cane. "I am not a ghost. Ghosts do not bring the police." She looked up at the congregation, her eyes sweeping over the terrified faces of her so-called friends and family. "Stop screaming," she commanded, slamming the cane down again. "Everyone sit down. If you are healthy enough to run for the exit, you are healthy enough to sit and listen to what I have to say." The authority in her voice was absolute. The screaming died down to whimpers. People froze in the aisles, unsure whether to flee or obey. "I have spent the last month watching this man starve me," she announced, gesturing to Brad's prone body. "I watched him isolate me. I watched him steal from me. And today I watched him bury me while I was sitting in a police van outside eating a donut. You all came here to mourn Beatrice Wilson. Well, you can save your tears. The only thing that died today is his freedom." She turned to the police chief, who was standing stoically by her side with a pair of handcuffs already unhooked from his belt. "Officer," she said, smoothing the lapel of her cream blazer, "I believe this man has a flight to catch, but I do not think he is going to make it to the Cayman Islands. Would you be so kind as to escort him to his new accommodation? I hear the county jail is lovely this time of year." Chief Miller did not wait for Brad to regain his full senses or his dignity. He signaled to the two uniformed officers, who stepped forward and hoisted my brother-in-law off the cold marble floor by his armpits. Brad's legs dragged uselessly for a moment, his Italian leather shoes scuffing against the stone before he found his footing. He looked around wildly, his eyes finally focusing on the steel bracelets dangling from the chief's belt. "Get your hands off me!" Brad sputtered, his voice weak and reedy. "Do you know who I am? I am a respected investor. I know the mayor. This is harassment." Chief Miller did not blink. He spun Brad around with practiced efficiency, forcing his face against the polished wood of the communion rail. The sound of the handcuffs engaging was sharp and final. Click, click. It was the loudest sound in the room, louder than the screaming aunt, louder than the organ, louder than Brad's protests. It was the sound of consequences arriving. "Bradley Miller, you are under arrest," the chief announced, his voice booming with the authority of the law. "You have the right to remain silent, and I strongly suggest you use it because you have already done enough talking for a lifetime." Brad tried to squirm, but the officers held him fast. "On what grounds?" he shrieked, turning his head to look at the congregation for sympathy that was no longer there. "You cannot arrest a man at a funeral. This is sacrilege." The chief pulled a folded warrant from his pocket and began to read, ticking off the charges like items on a grocery list. You are being charged with 3 counts of wire fraud and insurance fraud for your attempt to claim a payout on a living policyholder. You are charged with aggravated elder abuse and neglect for the conditions found at the care facility. You are charged with 10 counts of forgery in the first degree for falsifying a last will and testament and multiple financial instruments. The chief paused, letting the weight of the list settle on Brad's shoulders. He leaned in close, ensuring that the microphone on the altar picked up the final devastating blow. And based on the confession you just provided to this entire assembly, and the recording secured by Ms. Olivia Wilson, the district attorney has authorized a charge of attempted murder in the first degree. You admitted to withholding life-sustaining care with the specific intent to cause death for financial gain. That is a Class X felony, son. You are looking at 20 years to life. Brad's knees buckled again, but the officers held him upright. The fight drained out of him instantly. The arrogance, the bluster, the unearned confidence of a mediocre man who thought he could outsmart the world, it all evaporated. He looked at Bianca, who was staring at him with a mixture of horror and revulsion. "Babe, call my dad," he pleaded, tears finally spilling down his cheeks. "Call the firm. Get me a lawyer. Do not let them take me." Bianca did not move. She did not reach for her phone. She simply watched as the officers began to drag her husband down the center aisle, past the rows of white lilies he had bought with stolen money, toward the exit where a squad car was waiting to take him to a place where his crypto wallet and his designer suits would mean absolutely nothing. The heavy oak doors slammed shut behind the weeping figure of my brother-in-law, sealing his fate. The silence that followed was thick enough to choke on. The air in the sanctuary was still vibrating with the shock of the arrest, but the drama was not quite finished. There was one loose end remaining, and she was currently standing in a puddle of water and broken lilies, her mascara running in jagged black streaks down her face. Bianca looked around the room, her eyes darting from the judging faces of the church mothers to the stoic police officers, and finally, desperately, to the woman standing like a statue in the center aisle. She knew she was cornered. With Brad gone, she had no shield, no scapegoat, and no money. Her survival instinct, honed by years of manipulating everyone around her, kicked into overdrive. She did not run. She collapsed. It was a performance that would have garnered applause on Broadway. She threw herself toward our mother, sliding the last few feet on her knees until she was clutching the hem of Beatrice's cream pantsuit. "Mom! Oh God, Mom!" she wailed, her voice cracking with a hysteria that was only half feigned. "You have to believe me. I did not know. I swear on my life I did not know. It was all him. It was all Brad. He lied to me. He told me he was handling everything. He told me the doctors said you were gone. I am a victim here too, Mama." She buried her face against Beatrice's legs, sobbing loudly, her hands gripping the fabric as if she were drowning. "He threatened me, Mom. He said if I did not go along with him, he would hurt me. I was terrified. I wanted to call you every single day. I wanted to come get you. But I was so scared. Please, Mama, look at me. It is your Bianca. It is your baby girl." The room watched, breathless. For decades, this had been the dynamic. Bianca would mess up, Bianca would cry, and Beatrice would forgive her. The golden child could do no wrong. I stood off to the side, my phone still in my hand, waiting to see if the pattern would hold. If Mom forgave her now after everything, then my victory was hollow. Beatrice looked down at the sobbing woman clutching her legs. She did not reach down to stroke her hair. She did not offer a comforting hand. She stood perfectly still, her face an unreadable mask of granite. She looked at Bianca not with anger, but with a profound, icy indifference. She shifted her weight slightly, pulling her leg back just enough to break Bianca's grip. "Stand up, Bianca," she said, her voice devoid of any maternal warmth. Bianca looked up, hope flickering in her tear-stained eyes. "Mom, I said stand up," Beatrice repeated, her tone sharp enough to cut glass. "You are making a scene, and quite frankly, you are going to ruin my Italian suede shoes with that cheap mascara." Bianca froze. The rejection was physical. She slowly pulled herself up, her hands trembling, looking at a mother she no longer recognized. The woman who had enabled her for 30 years was gone. In her place was a stranger who had survived hell and had no patience left for crocodile tears. "You claim you did not know," Beatrice asked, her voice low and dangerous. "You lived in the same house. You spent the money. You drove the car he bought with my pension. Did you think money just fell from the sky, Bianca? Or did you just not care where it came from as long as you did not have to work for it? Do not insult my intelligence by playing the fool. You were not a victim. You were an accomplice who just got caught." I walked past the stunned police officers and placed a battered, dusty cardboard shoebox on the polished surface of the communion table. It was an old sneaker box, held together by yellowing Scotch tape, the kind you find in the back of a closet. To the congregation, it looked like garbage. To a forensic accountant, it was a treasure chest of intent. Bianca stopped her, sniffling, her eyes locking onto the box with a flicker of recognition that betrayed her completely. She knew exactly what was inside. She had probably spent years thinking these documents had been thrown away, lost in the clutter of a life she deemed irrelevant. "You can stop the performance, Bianca," I said, resting my hand on the lid. "We are past the point of plausible deniability. Brad might have been the muscle behind this operation, the one who physically moved Mom and signed the forms, but do not insult us by pretending you were just a bystander. You were not a victim, you were the architect." I lifted the lid. Inside, stacked in neat chronological bundles, were dozens of handwritten letters. I pulled out a stack of pastel-colored envelopes, the kind Bianca favored to make her poison look polite. "Do you recognize these?" I asked, holding them up for the room to see. "These are not birthday cards. These are not thank you notes. These are the letters you wrote to Mom over the last 3 years. Every time you needed money for a vacation or a new car or an art gallery that never opened, you put it in writing." I pulled a sheet of paper from the bundle, the expensive stationery crinkling in the silence of the church. Dated August 12th of last year. "Mom, you are being selfish holding on to that big house. Brad and I need the capital for his investment. If you do not sell and give us the proceeds, do not expect us to come for Christmas. You are choosing bricks over your own flesh and blood." I dropped the letter onto the table and picked up another. Dated January 4th. "If you do not sign the power of attorney, we are going to have you declared incompetent. We will put you in a home where no one speaks English. Sign the papers, Mom. Stop making this hard on everyone." The congregation murmured. The image of the dutiful daughter was dissolving, replaced by a picture of a woman who had been bullying her mother for years. Bianca shook her head, taking a step back. "I was stressed," she whispered. "I did not mean it. I was just trying to get her to be reasonable." "Reasonable," I repeated, my voice dropping to a chill. "Is that what you call this?" I reached back into the box and pulled out a small black notebook. It was cheap, the binding fraying, the pages dog-eared. This was the journal Mom kept at Shady Pines. She hid it under her mattress because she was afraid the nurses would take it away. She wrote in it every single day until her hands became too weak to hold the pen. I opened the book to a page marked with a red sticky note. October 3rd. Called Bianca again today. She sent it to voicemail. The nurse brought me cold oatmeal. I asked for water, but they said my daughter gave instructions to limit my fluids to prevent accidents. I am so thirsty. Why does she hate me? Why won't she come? I looked up from the page. Bianca was no longer crying. She was staring at the floor, her face pale, stripped of all defenses. The diary proved that the neglect wasn't just Brad's idea. It was a coordinated strategy. She knew her mother was suffering. She knew her mother was begging for water, and she ignored the calls because she was too busy spending the advance on the inheritance. I closed the book with a sharp snap that echoed like a gunshot. You stood there and told Mom you didn't know. You told her you were deceived. But the ink doesn't lie, sister. You created the environment that allowed Brad to thrive. You pushed for the power of attorney. You pushed for the isolation. You were not tricked, Bianca. You are an accomplice. And unlike Brad, you don't even have the excuse of being a gambling addict. You did it out of pure, unadulterated greed. Beatrice stared down at the damning evidence scattered across the communion table. The letters, the diary, the proof of a daughter's betrayal. She did not look angry anymore. Anger implies passion, and passion implies a connection. Instead, her face settled into the stony, impenetrable expression of a judge delivering a final sentence. She closed the lid of the shoebox with a soft, final thud that sounded like a coffin latching shut. "For 35 years I have made excuses for you," she said, her voice dropping to a register so low and cold it made the air in the sanctuary feel thin. "I blamed your father for spoiling you. I blamed society. I blamed myself. I told myself that underneath the greed and the vanity, there was still the little girl I held in my arms. But looking at you now shivering in your expensive dress, I realize the truth. That little girl is gone, and I am done mourning her." Bianca opened her mouth to speak, to beg to offer one more lie, but Beatrice silenced her with a sharp, cutting motion of her hand. "Do not speak. You have lost the right to speak to me. As of this moment, you are dead to me. Not metaphorically, legally, financially, spiritually. On Monday morning, my attorney will file the paperwork to formally remove you from the family trust. You are being written out of the will. Your name will be struck from the deed of every property I own. You will not receive a penny. You will not receive a picture frame. You will not even receive a memory." Beatrice took a step closer, invading Bianca's personal space. Her eyes locked onto the diamond and pearl pendant resting against Bianca's collarbone. It was a vintage piece, passed down through 4 generations of Wilson women, a symbol of continuity and matriarchal power. "And I believe you are wearing something that does not belong to you," Beatrice said, extending her hand palm up. "That necklace was my grandmother's. It is reserved for the women of this family. Since you are no longer a member of this family, you will return it. Now." Bianca's hand flew to her throat, clutching the pearls protectively. "Mom, please," she whimpered, her voice barely a squeak. "Grandma gave this to me on my 16th birthday. It is all I have left. It belongs to a Wilson." Beatrice replied, her voice unyielding. "And as far as I am concerned, the only Wilson daughter standing in this room is Olivia. Take it off, Bianca. Do not make me ask the nice police officer to remove it as evidence of theft." The threat hung in the air. Bianca looked at the chief of police, who crossed his arms and stared back impassively. She realized she had no allies left. With shaking fingers, she fumbled with the delicate clasp at the nape of her neck. It took her 3 tries, her hands were trembling so violently. Finally, the latch gave way. The heavy necklace slid from her skin, pooling into a glittering pile in her palm. She held it out, tears streaming freely, now genuine tears of loss for the status she was surrendering. Beatrice plucked the necklace from her hand without touching her skin, as if avoiding contamination. She slipped the jewelry into her pocket without a second glance. "Now get out," Beatrice said, pointing her cane toward the open doors where the sunlight was blinding. "Leave this church. Leave my sight. And if I ever see you on my doorstep again, I will not call a priest. I will call the hounds. Go." Bianca stood there for a second, stripped of her husband, her inheritance, her jewelry, and her name. She looked at the sea of faces, former friends who now looked at her with disgust. She let out a choked sob, turned on her heel, and ran. She ran past the empty pews, past the cold soup, past the wreckage of her life, and disappeared into the bright, unforgiving world outside. Beatrice watched her go, then turned to me. She didn't smile, but her shoulders relaxed, the heavy weight finally gone. "It is done," she whispered. "Now let us go get some real food. I am starving." The heavy wooden doors thudded shut, sealing Bianca's wails outside. The silence that returned to the banquet hall was thick with tension, the kind that hangs in the air after a violent storm. The remaining guests shifted uncomfortably in their seats, eyeing the exits, unsure if they were witnessing a crime scene or a miracle. Beatrice Wilson did not let the confusion linger. She surveyed the room with the critical eye of a general inspecting the troops after a battle, her gaze sweeping over the clusters of terrified social climbers and the few genuine faces scattered among them. She tapped her cane against the marble floor, a sharp double click that commanded immediate attention. Now she announced, her voice brisk and devoid of sentimentality. "We need to do a little housekeeping." She pointed her cane directly at the table near the front, where Brad's crypto investor friends were huddled, looking like deer caught in headlights. "You gentlemen in the shiny suits, the ones who came here to network over my coffin, the free bar is closed. Your investment just left in handcuffs, and I suggest you follow him out the door before I ask the chief of police to run background checks on all of you." The men did not need to be told twice. They scrambled for their coats, knocking over chairs in their haste to escape the gaze of the formidable woman at the altar. Beatrice watched them flee, then turned her attention to the back corner. "Sarah," she called out. Aunt Sarah, who was trying to make herself invisible behind a large fern, froze. Beatrice walked slowly down the aisle until she was standing just a few feet away. Sarah tried to summon a smile, but it looked more like a grimace. "Beatrice. Honey, you were just leaving." Beatrice interrupted, her voice cutting like a knife. "I saw what you did to Olivia's dress. I saw you choose sides before my body was even cold. Olivia is the only reason you still have a roof over your head, Sarah. She paid your mortgage while you mocked her behind her back. Well, the Bank of Wilson is officially closed. Go home, and do not bother checking your account on the 1st of the month. The transfer has been cancelled." Sarah gasped, realizing the gravity of her mistake. She looked to me for mercy, but I simply raised my glass of ice water in a mock toast. She gathered her oversized hat and scurried out the side door, followed by a stream of church mothers who realized their gossip train had just derailed. Within minutes, the room was empty of the parasites. The crowd had thinned from 200 to a modest 20. Left behind were the people who mattered: Keisha, the waitress, the kitchen staff, a few of Mom's old bridge partners who had sat quietly in the back, refusing to believe the lies, and the organist. Beatrice looked around at the small, loyal group and smiled. It was the first genuine smile I had seen on her face in years. It reached her eyes, crinkling the corners with warmth. "Well," she said, clapping her hands together, "now that we have taken out the trash, we can finally begin the real party." She turned to the catering manager, who was standing by the kitchen doors looking terrified. "Throw that cold soup in the garbage. I know there are 50 pounds of fresh shrimp and a prime rib roast back there because I paid for them myself. Open the ovens. Open the wine. And for heaven's sake, kill this funeral dirge." She looked up at the organist in the loft. "Do you know any Stevie Wonder, young man?" The organist grinned and gave a thumbs up. "Then play it," she commanded. "Loud. I want to see smiles. I want to see dancing. We are not mourning a death today. We are celebrating a resurrection. And if anyone leaves this room hungry, I will be very offended." The organ swelled with the opening chords of "Signed, Sealed, Delivered." The tension broke instantly. The staff cheered. I walked over to my mother, who was already instructing a waiter on the proper way to uncork a bottle of vintage red. She looked at me, her eyes clear and fierce. "Are you hungry, Olivia?" she asked, linking her arm through mine. "I am starving, Mom," I replied, feeling the weight of the last month finally lift off my shoulders. "Good," she said, leading me toward the head table. "Because we have a lot of work to do. But first we eat. And remind me to burn this lilies. They are giving me a headache." The metallic buzz of the heavy security door signaled the beginning of my allotted 15 minutes. I walked into the visiting room of the Cook County Jail, the scent of industrial cleaner and stale sweat hitting me instantly. It was a stark contrast to the lavender-scented air of my penthouse, but I did not mind. I sat down on the cold metal stool in booth number 4 and waited. On the other side of the thick, scratched plexiglass, a door opened. A guard shoved a man into the chair opposite me. It took a moment for my brain to reconcile the image. The man before me was not the arrogant, suit-wearing crypto investor who had stood at the altar 3 months ago. This man was gaunt. His skin was sallow, the fake tan long gone, replaced by the pallor of confinement. His hair, usually gelled to perfection, hung in greasy clumps around his face. He wore a jumpsuit the color of a traffic cone, a shade that did him no favors. Brad picked up the black receiver with trembling hands. I picked up mine, keeping my face perfectly neutral. "Olivia," he breathed, his voice cracking. "Thank God you came. You have to help me. You have to talk to Beatrice." I watched him squirm. He looked like a rat trapped in a maze that had no exit. "Help you with what, Brad?" "With the lawyer," he hissed, leaning forward until his forehead rested against the glass. "The public defender they gave me is a moron. He wants me to plead guilty. He says they have too much evidence. He says I am looking at 15 years, Olivia. 15 years. I cannot do that time. I will die in here." I smoothed a non-existent wrinkle on my sleeve. That sounds like a standard sentence for attempted murder and grand larceny. "The system seems to be working." "Stop it," he begged, tears welling in his eyes. "I need a real defense team. I need the firm you used for the estate. I need $50,000 for a retainer. Please, Olivia. I know Mom has it. Just tell her I am sorry. Tell her it was a mistake. Tell her I will pay her back every cent once I get back on my feet." I almost laughed. The delusion was fascinating. He still believed there was a way back. He still believed he was a player in the game. "Mom does not have a son-in-law named Brad," I said calmly. "And I do not have a brother-in-law. You seem to be confused about your standing in the Wilson family." I reached into my bag. Brad's eyes lit up, presumably hoping for a checkbook or a legal document. Instead, I pulled out a single glossy photograph. I pressed it flat against the glass so he could see every detail. It was a picture taken last week in the sunroom of the house he had tried to steal. The light was golden and warm. In the center sat my mother, looking radiant and healthy, holding a glass of iced tea. I stood behind her, my hand on her shoulder. We were smiling. The space next to Mom where Brad used to stand in every Christmas card was empty. It wasn't just empty. The composition had been changed. We had filled the space with a large, beautiful vase of red roses. "We took this for the new family newsletter," I explained. "We did a little redecorating. We removed the clutter. We removed the debt. And most importantly, we removed the cancer." Brad stared at the photo, his eyes moving from Mom's smile to the empty space where he used to exist. The reality finally hit him. He wasn't just in jail. He was erased. "You are a monster," he whispered, the receiver shaking against his ear. The auctioneer, a man with a voice like a gravel grinder, stepped up to the podium. He announced the next lot. It was the Oak Brook property. The sprawling 5-bedroom McMansion that Bianca had mortgaged her soul to keep. The house with the heated floors, the wine cellar, and the custom walk-in closet that was larger than my first apartment. Now it was just a file number. Case 2940B. Distressed asset. Opening bid is set at $300,000, the auctioneer barked. "Do I hear 350? Bianca flinched with every number. She gripped the railing, her knuckles white. She was praying for a miracle. She was praying that no one would bid, that somehow the bank would show mercy. But banks do not show mercy, and neither do investors. 350, a man in a trench coat called out. 375, another voice countered. I stood silently in the back, checking the comp values on my tablet. The house was worth nearly $1 million in a fair market. But this was not a fair market. This was a slaughter. I waited until the bidding stalled at $450,000. The investors were hesitant. They knew the property had liens. They knew the previous owner, Brad, had likely stripped the copper wiring before he was arrested. They saw risk. I saw opportunity. 500,000, I said, my voice cutting through the drizzle. Cash. The heads turned. Bianca gasped, her eyes locking onto me. She saw her sister. She saw salvation. Going once at 500,000. Going twice. Sold to bidder number 42. The gavel slammed down. The sound echoed like a gunshot, signaling the final end of Bianca's reign as the Queen of Oak Brook. She didn't wait for the paperwork. She ducked under the caution tape and ran toward me, a pathetic mixture of relief and entitlement washing over her face. "Olivia!" she cried, reaching out to hug me, though I stepped back to avoid her wet coat. "You did it. You saved the house. I knew you wouldn't let strangers take it. Thank God. I can have my keys back. I have been sleeping on a friend's couch and my back is killing me." I looked at her, truly looking at her, and felt nothing. No anger, no pity, just the cold detachment of an auditor closing a file. "You seem confused, Bianca," I said, tucking the receipt into my briefcase. "I did not save the house for you. I acquired an asset for the Beatrice Wilson Foundation." Her smile faltered. "What?" "We needed a headquarters," I explained, checking my watch. "The rent in the city is exorbitant. This property provides ample office space for our staff. Your master bedroom will make an excellent conference room. The wine cellar will be converted into file storage for our legal aid clinic. And the pool. We are filling it in to create a parking lot for the volunteers." Bianca stared at me, her mouth agape. "You are turning my home into an office." "It is not your home, Bianca. It is a tax write-off. And frankly, it is the first time that building will ever be used for something good. You can stop by if you want, but you will need an appointment. We are going to have very strict security. We cannot have unauthorized personnel loitering on the premises." I signaled for my driver, who pulled the black sedan up to the curb. I got in, leaving her standing in the rain, staring at the receipt in my hand as if it were a death warrant. She had wanted to live in luxury forever. Now her legacy would be shredded, repurposed, and used to help the very people she used to look down on. The fluorescent lights of the discount mart hummed with a headache-inducing frequency that seemed designed to drain the human spirit. At Register 6, the conveyor belt moved with a jerky mechanical whine. The woman standing behind the register did not look like the debutante who had once sipped champagne at the Peninsula Hotel. Her hair, once a glossy, highlighted mane that cost hundreds of dollars to maintain, was now pulled back into a frizzy, dull ponytail held by a cheap elastic band. Her face was scrubbed clean of makeup, revealing the fine lines and tired circles that she used to hide behind layers of expensive foundation. Bianca wore a polyester vest that was 2 sizes too big, the fabric smelling faintly of stale onions. A name tag pinned crookedly to her chest read simply "Bianca" in generic block letters. There was no title, no status, just a name that no longer commanded respect in any room. "I told you the coupon is for the family size, not the personal size," a customer shrieked, waving a crumpled piece of paper in Bianca's face. "Can you not read? Is it that hard to do your job?" Bianca flinched. The customer was a woman in her 60s, wearing a tracksuit and looking for a fight over 50 cents. In another life, Bianca would have mocked this woman. She would have made a cruel joke to Brad and had security remove her. Now Bianca simply lowered her head, her face burning with a humiliation that had become her daily bread. "I am sorry, ma'am," Bianca mumbled, her voice rasping from an 8-hour shift of repeating the same phrases. "I will call the manager for an override. Please be patient." "Patient," the woman scoffed. "I have been standing here for 10 minutes while you fumble around. You are incompetent." Bianca swallowed the lump in her throat. She tapped the call button, her fingernails short, unpainted, and chipped, clicking against the plastic keys. She stared at the chewing gum display to avoid making eye contact with the line of impatient people building up behind the angry woman. That was when she saw it. It was tucked into the wire rack next to the tabloids and candy bars. Chicago Business Weekly. The cover was glossy and bright, a stark contrast to the gray misery of the checkout lane. And staring back at her from the front page were 2 women. On the left was Beatrice Wilson, looking fierce and elegant in a royal blue suit, holding her cane like a scepter. On the right was Olivia, wearing a sharp white blazer, smiling with a confidence that radiated off the page. The headline screamed in bold gold letters, "The Revival: How the Wilson Foundation is Revolutionizing Elder Care and Reclaiming a Legacy." Bianca froze, Her hand hovered over the scanner. For a second, the sounds of the store faded. She looked at her mother and sister. They looked powerful. They looked happy. They looked complete. And they looked like they belonged to a world that Bianca could no longer even touch. She remembered the necklace. She remembered the house. She remembered the feeling of being the golden child. Now looking at the magazine, she realized she was not even a footnote in their story anymore. She was just a spectator standing on the wrong side of the velvet rope wearing a polyester vest. "Hey lady," the customer barked, snapping her fingers in Bianca's face. "Are you going to scan my peas, or are you going to stare at the magazines all day?" Bianca jumped, the reality of her life crashing back down on her. She quickly grabbed the bag of frozen peas, the cold plastic biting into her fingers. She looked away from the magazine, unable to bear the sight of the family she had thrown away for a husband who was currently rotting in a cell. "I am scanning it now," Bianca whispered, a tear escaping her eye and sliding down her cheek. She wiped it away quickly with her sleeve before anyone could see. She scanned the item. The machine let out a loud, harsh beep. It was the sound of her new life. "That will be $3.99, she said, keeping her eyes fixed on the register screen. She did not look at the magazine again. She couldn't afford to. The sunlight hitting the terrace in Positano was different from the light in Chicago. It was warmer, richer, and it did not carry the gray weight of obligation. I sat across from Beatrice Wilson, watching her devour a plate of truffle pasta with a ferocity that would have terrified the nutritionists at the nursing home. She paused only to take a sip of a Barolo that cost more than my first car. She looked out over the cliffside, the turquoise water of the Tyrrhenian Sea sparkling below us, and let out a sigh that wasn't about pain or exhaustion. It was pure, unadulterated contentment. She was wearing a wide-brimmed straw hat and oversized designer sunglasses, looking less like a retired schoolteacher and more like a Hollywood starlet on a secret getaway. The mahogany cane was leaning against the stone railing, forgotten. In the last 3 months, we had hit London, Paris, and now the Amalfi Coast. We had seen the opera in Vienna. We had shopped on Bond Street. We had done everything she had put off for 40 years because she was too busy saving every penny for a daughter who wanted her dead. "Mom," I said, reaching for the breadbasket, "do you want to rest this afternoon? We have been walking all morning and the hills here are steep." She lowered her sunglasses and looked at me with mock offense. "Rest. I spent 6 months resting in that godforsaken bed at Shady Pines, Olivia. I have had enough rest to last me an eternity. No. After lunch I want to rent that boat." The handsome young man at the concierge desk said the grottos are beautiful at sunset, and I intend to see them. I smiled, taking a sip of my sparkling water. This was the woman who had been hidden away. This was the spirit Brad tried to crush with sedatives and neglect. He had failed miserably. Every laugh she let out, every euro she spent, every new memory she made was a direct act of rebellion against the fate he had planned for her. She was not just surviving, she was thriving. She was reclaiming every stolen moment with compound interest. I watched her flirt harmlessly with the waiter as he cleared our plates, her Italian terrible but her charm undeniable. It occurred to me that for years I thought I was the successful one because I had the career and the penthouse. But watching Beatrice Wilson navigate her renaissance, I realized I was just learning how to live. She was the master. She had shed the dead weight of toxic loyalty and found that underneath she was still light as a feather. She caught me staring and reached across the table, patting my hand. Her grip was strong. The tremors were gone, banished by proper medication and the absence of stress. "Stop auditing me, Olivia," she teased, her eyes twinkling behind the dark lenses. "The books are balanced, the debts are paid, and the surplus is being invested right here." She pointed to the view to the wine to us. She was right. We were not running away from the past. We were running toward a future that finally belonged to us. I raised my glass to hers. "To the surplus," I said, "and to the best investment we ever made." She clinked her glass against mine, the sound ringing out clear and true over the ocean, the perfect closing note to a long, dark chapter. The bright, warm memory of the Italian sun dissolves, replaced by the cool, glittering skyline of Chicago at night, visible through the floor-to-ceiling windows of my penthouse. The rain is tapping a gentle, rhythmic beat against the glass, a stark contrast to the chaos of the storm I orchestrated 3 months ago. I am back on the velvet sofa, where this story began, the same spot where I first plotted the destruction of my brother-in-law. The room is quiet now. It is a peaceful silence, not the heavy, suffocating silence of secrets, but the light, airy silence of a ledger that has been perfectly balanced. I pick up the glass of wine from the coffee table. It is the same Barolo Mom and I discovered in Positano. She is currently asleep in the guest suite down the hall, resting up for her art class tomorrow morning. She is snoring softly, a sound that used to annoy me when I was a teenager, but now sounds like the most beautiful music in the world, because it is the sound of her being alive. It is the sound of her being safe. People have asked me if it was worth it. They ask if the deception was too cruel, if the shock was too great, if the legal risks were too high. They look at me with a mixture of admiration and fear, wondering what kind of woman stages a funeral for her own mother. They wonder how I could sit there in that front pew wearing black, wiping away fake tears, watching my sister mourn a death that had not happened. They think it was cold. They think it was calculated. They are absolutely right. It was cold. It was calculated. It was the most precise audit I have ever conducted. You see, you cannot fight a cancer with aspirin. You cannot fight a predator like Brad with polite conversation or legal letters. He would have dodged them. He would have hidden the money. He would have isolated Mom until she truly faded away in that gray room. He needed to believe he had won. He needed to believe the finish line was crossed. He needed to feel the weight of the insurance money in his pocket so that he would let his guard down long enough to admit his crimes to the world. I swirl the wine in the glass, watching the dark red liquid coat the sides. I had to break my family to fix it. I had to destroy the illusion of the happy sister and the successful husband to reveal the rot underneath. I had to become the villain in their story so I could be the hero in hers. And looking at the peace in this apartment tonight, looking at the freedom my mother now enjoys, I would do it again. I would do it twice. I set the glass down on the marble coaster with a soft click. I smoothed the fabric of my dress, the red one hanging in the closet, now retired as a battle flag. The game is over. The pieces have been swept off the board. The winners have been declared. I lean forward, looking directly into the camera lens, my expression calm and resolute. That is how I used a fake funeral to save a real life. We are taught from a young age that blood is thicker than water. We are conditioned to believe that family is an unbreakable covenant, a sanctuary where we are owed loyalty simply by virtue of sharing a last name. We are told to forgive the unforgivable because, after all, they are family. But if this audit has proven anything, it is that biology is merely a suggestion. It is not a binding contract. The DNA you share with someone does not grant you a license to abuse them, neglect them, or view them as a walking bank account. My sister and her husband made a fatal error in their calculations. They believed that inheritance was a right, not a privilege. They looked at my mother, and they did not see a woman who had sacrificed, loved, and built a life. They saw an asset to be liquidated. They saw a barrier between them and the lifestyle they felt entitled to. They let greed calcify their hearts until they were incapable of feeling anything but the hunger for more. And in doing so, they lost everything. Not just the money, not just the house, but the very soul of what it means to be human. The true value of a family does not lie in a pedigree or a family tree. It lies in how you treat one another when no one is watching. It lies in the glass of water offered to a thirsty hand. It lies in the time spent listening to a story you have heard 1,000 times. It lies in the respect you show to the people who raised you. If you treat your loved ones like transactions, do not be surprised when you end up bankrupt in the only currency that matters. Bianca thought she was securing her future. Instead, she erased her past. She traded a mother's love for a chance at a payout, and she ended up with neither. That is the ultimate tragedy of greed. It blinds you to the treasure standing right in front of you until it is gone. It makes you poor in spirit long before it makes you poor in cash. So if there is one thing you take away from the downfall of the House of Wilson, let it be this. Do not wait for a tragedy to audit your relationships. Look at the people around you. Ask yourself if you are there for them or for what they can give you. Call your parents, not because you need a loan, but because you want to hear their voice. Visit your grandparents, not to check the furniture you hope to inherit, but to hold their hands. Because eventually the funeral will be real. The flowers will not be props and the tears will not be staged. And when that day comes, you want to be able to look in the mirror and know that you loved them for who they were, not for what they were worth. You want to know that your grief is the price of love, not the panic of a lost investment. My name is Olivia Wilson. The books are balanced, the case is closed, and I have a mother to go hug. You know they say money changes people. I disagree. I think money simply acts as a high-powered magnifying glass. It shows you exactly who people always were, amplifying their traits until they are impossible to ignore. In my case, it revealed a monster and a leech. But it also revealed a survivor in my mother and a fighter in me. It clarified everything. And while the method I used was extreme, the pain of that realization is something many of you unfortunately understand all too well. My story had police raids and secret cameras, but the core of it is painfully common. It happens in living rooms over wills that are suddenly changed. It happens in hospitals where care decisions are made based on costs rather than comfort. It happens in quiet conversations where siblings calculate their parents' expiration dates like they are checking the milk in the fridge. It is a silent epidemic of greed that tears families apart from the inside out. I want to hear from you. I want to know that I am not the only one who had to draw a line in the sand. Have you ever been betrayed by a relative for financial gain? Have you ever watched a family dinner turn into a hostile negotiation? Have you ever felt the knife twist in your back, only to turn around and see a face you have known since childhood, holding the handle? Do not keep it a secret. Shame is the weapon they use to keep us quiet. They bank on the fact that we will be too embarrassed to talk about the theft, the manipulation, and the hurt. Well, we are breaking that silence today. Go to the comment section below and share your story. Let it out. You might find that your experience is not as isolated as you think. We can build a community here, a place where we support the black sheep who are actually the only honest ones in the flock. And if you enjoyed watching justice be served, if you found satisfaction in seeing the wicked finally pay their tab, then make sure you are part of this channel. Hit that subscribe button. Turn on the notifications. We have many more stories to tell, many more audits to conduct. And trust me, you do not want to miss what comes next. We are just getting started with cleaning up the mess. I have a vintage Barolo breathing on the counter and a mother who is probably dreaming of her next European adventure. The storm is over. The air is clear. And for the first time in a long time, the future looks profitable in all the ways that actually matter. So protect your heart, protect your assets, and never apologize for demanding the respect you deserve. I lift the crystal glass, the deep red wine catching the light of the city skyline behind me. I look directly into the lens, holding your gaze for a beat longer than necessary. A small, knowing smile plays on my lips. I offer you a slow, deliberate wink. Cheers. The image holds for a second on my victorious expression before the screen slowly fades to black, leaving you with nothing but your own reflection and the truth. The Wilson family saga teaches us a brutal truth. Blood is not a binding contract of loyalty. Brad and Bianca viewed a living mother as a mere obstacle to their inheritance, allowing greed to calcify their hearts. They calculated their future based on her death only to lose everything when she reclaimed her life. True wealth isn't found in a property deed, it is found in genuine care and respect. When you treat loved ones like financial transactions, you inevitably end up bankrupt in the only currency that matters. Don't let money cost you your soul. Hit subscribe if you agree that justice is the best dish served cold.